Taubman. I'm an associate professor of architecture, and I teach classes in design, construction, digital technology, and as John Marshall mentioned, smart surfaces. I want to thank all the presenters for coming today, and I want to take up Julian's charge. Maybe it wasn't a charge to us, but this notion of up and to the right. So this topic for our conversation at least, is about smart technology, smart stuff. I think Bruce mentioned this idea of thing-infrastructure, and I've also been thinking about this notion of geek chic all weekend as we've been talking about technology. So to amp this up even further, maybe to go from smart stuff to think about intelligent, and to move from smart to intelligent, maybe to that next level. Michael Speaks already has this notion of design intelligence, so I started trying to think about intelligent design. Obviously, this is a term that's already been used before, so I couldn't use the conference as a way to coin that, but it actually seems pretty appropriate. And maybe to play this out even further, Architect Magazine on Thursday had an R&D symposium. Their phrase for this was geek is good, and maybe again about up and to the right, maybe this time geek is God. So the question, I guess, to the group is maybe to talk about this maybe as a comparison between intelligent design and evolution as a way to think about what work is happening. There's been topics about adaptation that people have mentioned, emergence, deterministic ideas, but I think all weekend there's been a topic about tools for others, and maybe not enough discussion about what the desire or agenda might be for this omniscient or divine designer that I think everybody up here, for me at least, I consider a divine designer or baker. Discuss.
Well, I don't think it's so much divine. I think if people work hard and grasp knowledge what they're doing, I think they can do pretty much what they want, and they do not have to rely on tools that other people made. So I don't think we have to inflate it until something which is we cannot reach. I think we can all use the opportunity to be a divine designer ourselves.
Well, I think that as the daughter of an Episcopal priest who did not believe in God, he really thought it was just sort of a lovely construct for the masses who dealt with it in terms of what a public relationship should be like. The result is I'm amoral. And so, when I think about divine and I think about whether it's the greater good, I guess I'm falling more into the camp of banality, that I'm much more of a deep-seated pragmatist, that if I could just understand how one thing works, that's divine for me.
Yeah.
In some of the sort of more research-based explorations that our group has tried to wade into, it all deals with sort of the complexities of the projects that we're actually working on, and trying to get our heads around all of that information. And especially at the early stages of design, and there's some, perhaps it's a naive ambition to create frameworks that are capable of absorbing all the various parameters that come into play. But certainly there is an ambition there to look at things from a systems perspective, and being able to develop frameworks that are gracefully capable of dealing with all of that information and generating something compelling. So, I mean, in terms of thinking about things as systems and creating a world in which they can commingle, that's something that especially I'd say in our urban design practice that we've been interested in investigating.
It's an interesting provocation. I think that whether it's intelligent or smart, I think that at least being a sort of newbie to the practice of design and learning to be a designer, what I find most valuable is maybe I think what I got most from Anna's presentation was that it's more ways of showing people to look at the world and understand the world. So rather than the specific technology or the specific, the level of smartness of it or intelligence of it, I think one thing that is perhaps most valuable is just understanding that you can look at the world differently. So you can look at it with a different set of lenses or frameworks or based on a different set of principles. And maybe, I love this idea of an Episcopalian preacher who doesn't actually believe the word, but thinks of it as it's actually a good story. This is a story that's helpful to people and help them to understand the world and see the world in a different way, and maybe to give them guidance and so forth. And I think if there were one universal skill, so if there were one thing that I think would be wonderful for humanity to embody, would be that it doesn't have to be the way it is. So there is no the intelligent design without the dogma. It's like, I'm just going to think intelligently about this. I'm going to look at this world that I'm in a little bit differently for whatever reason, and that could just get to this DIY sense of like, well, you know what, I'm going to put some wheels on my luggage because I think it'll be better that way. And just those little small changes and not accepting things as they are, perhaps, just to make the world a little bit better.
But I think intelligence also means that you are open for new ideas. Otherwise, it doesn't evolve. So intelligence is not dogmatic that it's closed. I think it's open, that you learn and adapt, and that I think is the most important part of being intelligent.
So since you guys haven't run me off the stage yet,
brings
go ahead, Karl.
to mind an article where Stephen Johnson and Kevin Kelly, who both happen to have books with very similar themes, it just came out. There's a discussion between them. Kelly's book, What Technology Wants, and the other book, Where Good Ideas Come From, the Natural History of Innovation. And they talk about the technology being viewed as like evolution, and that in the history of good ideas, there's a kind of limit to the jump forward, but there's also been multiple versions of the same idea, often in many cases of major innovations. But that if you buy their arguments, that it's closer to an evolutionary growth and requiring this kind of collective thinking, in a sense, unconsciously almost, that the ideas were in the air and several people onto them at the same time.
Well, I think, Michelle, you just brought up this idea of being moral. And I think there's another aspect.
I said amoral.
Amoral. Well, it's all But I think there's also one example that I was thinking about recently was my wife likes to use this app on her iPhone to take pictures of books and send it to Amazon, and then it sends back what book that is. And I recently discovered that it's not an app at all, that it's people that do that. And so we actually have a condition now where people are masquerading as technology. So for me, that became a kind of moral dilemma. I yell at her every time she does it. You're making someone have to look that up. But in a recent conversation with someone, they told me, well, someone's making money doing that. And so now we're in this position where there's actually people pretending to be computers. And I wonder if that's smart or not.
Well, if you can make some money, why not?
Why do you always look in my direction?
could back me up.
Bruce mentioned the book The Shock of the Old, which I think gets to this point about the mechanical Turk people, because I mean it's a well-known that computers were first people. They were just people called computers because that's what they did. They computed. So this wonderful kind of like, that's a shock, but actually has been present in that history for quite some time.
I had 2 questions for you guys, and that was it.
Just a comment, backtracking to the previous comment about, well, I was at a conference recently, and one of the speakers was talking about the nature of technologies, the book that he had written, and talking about the evolution of technology and how technology itself evolves as people co-opt it and reconfigure it and reinterpret it and so forth. And saying that he then began to wonder, is technology actually alive? And he said he went back and looked at all kinds of definitions of what life is, and said that by virtually every description that he saw, that technology itself qualified as a form of life. And somebody said, of course, well, but technology requires humans in order to evolve. And to which he later thought about and said, well, humans themselves have all kinds of parasitic hosts that they need in order to survive. That our bodies are full of bacteria and so forth, that we would not be able to survive if it weren't for them. And so it was kind of an interesting juxtaposition that way about what's alive and the idea of evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely wouldn't disagree with this sort of definition of technology as being alive somehow, or it brings me back to the closing question yesterday: is anything synthetic? Or we could turn that around and say, is anything not synthetic? At the same time, I think the term evolution is we need more actual terminology, if you will. It has a lot of baggage that is associated with sort of progressivist ideas of modernity, and I wonder whether or not we're really talking about a constantly mutating condition rather than an evolving condition. It's just a question whether or not that's the term we're seeking, and what we mean exactly by an evolving condition.
Well, let me throw out a provocation for Karl. That I guess I've always been whether fascinated or disappointed in that there's the only technology that's perhaps more archaic and moved along more slowly than the automotive industry are the technologies that we use in building, whether it's in building design or building manufacturing or building systems, and even, of course, the tools that we use for simulation and modeling really are quite dated and underdeveloped in comparison to what happens in other places. And yet we probably talk about technology and smart systems and the future and the possibilities more than we hear in many of the other professions for whom it's completely ubiquitous. Maybe I'm not throwing out a provocation, but
we agree.
Well, there's certainly an issue, I think, when we look at people in general and their ability to adapt to different situations. And this is probably one of the issues why, if it's cold, we can put a coat on, we can be uncomfortable, and we can kind of bear with it. And maybe we're seeing the repercussions of that to some extent. But I think it's our ability to kind of change and adapt to those situations that I think, maybe doesn't put enough pressure on technology or as much as it should.
Yet I think that there were some incredible provocations in the last lecture, that it is true that we have this kind of adaptability, to project, let's say, our envelope through clothing and other things. And then what I find fascinating about the last presentation is that when you start to extrapolate that into a larger scale, it's not just about a kind of individual preference of adaptability. It's really gets into the kind of social realm of negotiating how a building or a set of, let's say, collective structures are going to adapt, because clearly those are going to be decisions that are made on some level, and the question is how do they get negotiated? I think that really brings us into a very different era.
I'd like to ask Michelle, do you see any conditions how this can change in the building industry?
You know, I don't know. And I think it also goes back to your very first question about, you know, the larger agenda and the bigger ideas. That I think as I work more on it, it's not that I become less hopeful. It's more that I become not only just much more pragmatic, but much more interested in sort of the momentary and the immediate. And so how it changes, I don't know. Where it's going to change, I think I probably know even less than what some of the previous speakers have mentioned on that. But what do you think?
Well, perhaps if the resources get more depleted, that you have a sense of urgency, things might change.
Well,
maybe just
one can hope.
over
So.
to Craig, if you want to talk about how some of these change when they get scaled up, and what the increase of complexity might lend to those systems.
Yeah, well, for us, the scale shift happened to just unintentionally coincide with the compressed time frame in some of these. So, for instance, that City of the Future was a week-long charrette, you know, where they're just, by necessity, was a kind of, the whole project was a kind of brainstorming, and not just about sheer invention, but we took up a lot of that week in a kind of intensive research as to, you know, things on the bleeding edge of technology, or things in the works that weren't completely harebrained, like the idea of the tunneling system. I didn't get to describe that project, but if anyone knows about it, it's this underground network of an infrastructure that we propose to be built with self-drilling robots and nanotube walls to the tunnels, which some claim with research underway that that's one way to store hydrogen fuel safely. We'll see if that pans out. But the premise that a big component of that project involved using bay shore lands inundated by rising waters to turn them into an aquaculture zone to raise algae for biofuel. That hydrogen is the ultimate product, and it was about synthesizing all the ideas and making it legible, but again, in a week's time. I mean, it almost forces some major editing, obviously, but we're not an urban planning and design firm, really, that takes the kind of time to really vet out all of the issues at a scale like that. And the tower, which of the three projects I was going to show, was this medium scale, which was a kind of medium length of time, a few weeks, versus the jellyfish house, which was the smallest project in terms of the brief, but the longest period of thinking about it and being able to represent the thinking.
I'm actually surprised that there hasn't been more pushback. I mean, just to put my cards on the table, I completely disagree with this notion of the intelligent design, and I think we've saw it in a number of the projects, from the idea of the structural engineering, that we could run, you know, hundreds of these, but we already might know what the answer is. I think there's something, you know, we're trying to find the possibilities that maybe don't exist, that we don't consider already. Or I think a couple of the conversations, you know, discussing the history and the way that these things change and uncovering those. I think the need for a multidisciplinary team, which is something that you're working on, kind of eliminates the divine creator, the group of people that you're working with, the different technologies that you're using, whether that's the computer technology or just a kind of group of people So I think we're starting to see practice changing in some ways, even, you know, Craig, you talking about the interactive designers that you're working with. And so the way that these things start to hopefully open up new possibilities, or maybe buffer that against this notion about what our desire might be as designers or what we're trying to do, and how, I mean, are there any ideas about how we might figure those things out, or are people working to drive that decision-making process maybe?
We were talking in the office about sort of the role of experts in the process, and for a large firm like SOM, you know, the ability to absorb a certain amount of expertise in terms of people, and what does that mean in terms of trying to cultivate true expertise in an architectural practice versus you know, the collaborative model, and it. So I guess the conclusion we were coming to was that we are architects, that we're not computer scientists, we're not biologists, we're not you know, all these other disciplines, but you can probably develop a critical, and it's saying that I guess in a certain respect that we've always practiced it. You know, I'm not a structural engineer. I work with structural engineers. I've had enough conversations and worked on enough projects that I have a certain level of understanding of principles, so that I can have conversations and communicate ideas and so forth, but that at the end of the day you rely on somebody who has true expertise. And I think the same thing seems to me applies to these other areas that we're venturing into now. There's a need to develop a certain threshold of understanding in order to have those conversations, but not necessarily to try to necessarily be the expert, or to bring the expert in-house.
But you know, expertise is so different than knowledge. And I think sometimes that's what constrains us as a profession, is that, you know, we define what our interdisciplinary team is based on what it is that we do and what it is that we know. And therefore the experts that we bring in simply are people who are operating, you know, within that mode. That, you know, if we were to reach out for the kind of knowledge we needed, it wouldn't be with our normal, you know, group of collaborators. It'd be way beyond that with, you know, whether it's with theoretical physicists, whether it's with neurobiologists, whether it's with advanced energy engineers who have absolutely no interest in making anything that relates to a building. I think that's the challenge that we have for having any kind of technology transfer, any kind of knowledge transfer, is to really step out of our zone. We define ourselves as being interdisciplinary, but we're probably really remarkably insular in that standpoint.
Yeah,
the problem is that because I try to combine different, in my, I didn't show, but in my research, I combine different fields of disciplines like mechanical engineering and mathematics. But the problem is that everybody is so in their own discipline that if I do something with mathematics, the mathematicians say, oh, mechanics, you know. So everybody is so close in their own field. It's sometimes so hard to actually go to somebody and say, okay, I'm not a mathematician, but can we please talk about what is interesting in this intermediate field, and let down our guard and our presumptions toward each other. And it is really, I've tried, and it's so difficult because everybody thinks that their discipline is the best, and they're all this in their own, you know what I mean? It's so difficult to start that discussion with people.
Also, to go back to Usman Haq's presentation yesterday about providing forums for people to experiment and engage partially. Because I think that that's what happens within interdisciplinary communications. Certainly, I was trying to allude in my talk a little bit to the ways in which the academy and industries, certainly the academy, does not reward interdisciplinary exchange, because the idea of the accruing of the knowledge base within, let's say, these vertical silos of specialization is so reinforced. It's the way that you get rewarded. It's the language you have to speak, and you have to refer basically and build upon that sort of, you know, silo of specialization. And it's very risky. There's a huge amount of risk to venturing outside of that, and there's a huge amount of risk to immersing oneself in the language of another discipline in order to be able to even make that exchange. And I think that, you know, once again, it goes back to what we've been able to accomplish. I mean, we've accomplished everything that we see in front of us because of those vertical silos of specialization. they've been protected by capitalization, by production, the means of production. So I think that everything mitigates against those kinds of exchanges. And certainly learning a language takes years and years and years. The accruement of specialization as well. So even if we go outside of our disciplines, the possibility for a really dynamic exchange where we are co-creating, let's say, new knowledge that is outside of those rubrics, let's say, or paradigms, it's possible, but it's extremely difficult. I think all over the world, people are trying that. Obviously, there's a recognition that, there's sort of cracks in the armor in terms of these categorizations. But I think there's a lot of lip service to it, and I think that the ability to do it is still kind of staggeringly difficult, or a huge challenge, rather.
I think you're absolutely right, being someone who considers themselves an undisciplined kind of person, just because I've done, had so many different sorts of careers or experiences. But I don't want to, just to underscore, I think the point that I was trying to make in my presentation is it's a lot of it is about telling a really compelling story, so that person who says it's impossible, can't do it, starts to believe in it. And of course we know this because we're all involved in work that requires us to communicate a vision and enroll people into that vision, to from the structural engineer to the guy who's going to write the check. Like, I believe in this. I want this really badly. Let's make it happen. And that's why I'm so fascinated by science fiction, because it makes the impossible possible. And I think that there's not to say that in a sense we all are speculating about possible futures, which is what science fiction is really good at. And so I think learning from it as a storytelling practice has been actually in a very practical way quite useful. So in the studio that I'm in, we make small films that tell the story of like just a small little bit of technology that otherwise someone might be like, that's silly, I can't imagine that, that's not really possible. But just doing it in such a way that it begins to enroll them in that. Okay, I see what you're talking about now. And of course we know this well, that this is a technique, just being able to provide that representation to someone so that they're like, okay, that looks about right, which is why I think that thinking of things in scales, you begin to see the world differently, and just not being the kind of pragmatic, okay, slide 57 of the PowerPoint, this is how we're going to do this kind of structural feature and these kinds of things.
But I think one thing that's interesting too, that I understand Bruce Sterling's career so much, but that moving from a science fiction writer to now looking at things that are going on around him, and then at some point it seems like there's a number of examples where science fiction is actually behind what's possible technologically. And maybe it's like the example that you showed, just helping us to understand it, but certainly with bioethics as a potential topic, that's something that we see, that's the technology is probably further ahead than the science fiction is right now.
Yeah.
Certainly, I'd say there's an extremely compelling fictional aspect to any successfully designed object or artifact. Just the future cities, for example, even if it was a hallucination of 1 week, I mean, the fact that it produces so many possible things that will lead to provoke others to create other things. I'm thinking of the Succulent House yesterday by Heather Auberge. What it is as an artifact is a fraction of the tremendous ideas behind it, and the projection that allows for others to read a lot into it, that is sort of, I think, emerging. It's a truly emergent kind of condition that leads to a lot of possible futures. In my view, it's highly fictional on some level and still extremely actual. So I think that we have the term science fiction, within that category, but then we have the fictional aspects of all of the cultural artifacts that we produce, which lends the virtual character that leads to it becoming something else. So I think everything that we see, once again, like, I'm not saying that anything's fixed. Obviously, we know that none of this is fixed in front of us. It's a moment, and the question is, do we see, how much of what this is do we see from 1950? I don't know. This reminds me of the 1950s for some reason. But at the same time, it might remind me of a sequence out of one of the films that you showed me that, projects into a world that hasn't happened yet. And that's what's fascinating. I mean, I think it's truly fascinating the way so many science fiction films really do mine, sort of historical artifacts, and they sort of fold them into the art. And that's a particularly poignant aspect, I think, of many of the films that you showed.
Maybe that's one point, again, just returning to Julian's super low-tech slides of your graphs, but this notion that when we strive to go up and to the right, and this other discussion about trying to get other people involved in the process, that if we're trying to optimize for one thing at one point in time, there are probably excess technologies that come out of that and misfires that might be really appropriate and useful to other people in the process. And I think having those multidisciplinary discussions is a part of that, to mine all that other white space in your diagram. So thank you very much to the panel.